Broadcasting live in Tempe, Arizona, you are tuning in to the Culture Crush Business Podcast with Kendra Maples. We are here to highlight great companies and great resources for improving company culture.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Culture Crush Business Podcast. On this podcast, we focus on everything surrounding businesses with a good company culture. We deep dive with companies that are crushing it with a good culture, and we highlight the resources that are out there to help companies truly improve their company culture. And that's what we're going to do today. We have two amazing ladies that are in the space of being a resource to help improve, fix all of those things when it comes to company culture. Before I introduce the two of them, I do want to mention our sponsor. We have an amazing sponsor, Gateway Bank. They are a community bank in Arizona that specializes in serving small businesses across the valley and the country. And we are just extremely thankful for their support. When you work with Gateway, you don't have to call a 1-800 number for support or submit your loan application and wait weeks or months for an answer. You get fast personal service with a team who knows you and cares about you. So whether you need a loan or banking services for your business, Gateway is there to help. Visit gcbaz.com/Culture Crush for details and a free consultation with Bank President James Christensen. With all of that being said, now I want to introduce our two amazing guests today. We have Catherine Matisse, the founder and CEO of Civility Partners. Welcome.
Thank you.
And then we have Danielle Penner, principal attorney with Alta Employment Law Workplace Investigations. Welcome.
Thanks, Kendra.
I am really excited for this conversation because it's a different side of culture. It's a different angle of culture. We talk so much about culture from that perspective of employee engagement and feeling valued and seen and heard and all of those things, which is all extremely important. And then there's this other side of maybe the dark side of culture. What happens when it's really going wrong? And what happens when you have somebody in the workplace that is a bully or not up to par with the culture that should be in that space. And then what happens, there's this window, this space of, well, now what happens when it goes too far, right? And there are moments where we need to bring in that attorney side of things. And so there's a connection piece with both of you. We're going to talk about when folks reach out to one or the other. But before we dive into all of this, I want to give both of you the chance to really share with our audience who you are and what you do. So, Catherine, we are going to start with you. Tell us about you, what you do, how you got into it, all the good stuff.
Okay. Yeah, today's the conversation about toxic culture, not employee engagement. So thank you so much again for having both of us. So as the owner of Civility Partners, we were founded 15 years ago and actually founded Civility Partners right out of graduate school 15 years ago because I was the director of human resources and found myself working with a bully. If you've worked with a bully before, you know what that's like. They're very frustrating. So this particular individual yelled a lot. He made it very clear if he did not like you versus if he did. He was an uber micromanager. He just was frustrating. And so I was definitely at the receiving end of this behavior as well as many others. So I experienced bullying from an interpersonal angle. But then as a director of HR, I was dealing with all the problems he created. So I was really seeing firsthand, lucky me, the cost of bad behavior, dealing with the turnover. I spent a lot of time counseling people, talking to the president about it. So just tons of wasted time. And started graduate school while I was working there and ended up doing all of my graduate research on the topic of workplace bullying. And turns out there's 40 years of academic research on this topic from around the world. Mm-hmm. We are far behind here in the U.S. The United States, bullying's lawful, and we'll talk about all of that at some point, versus many other countries where it's actually unlawful. anyway, started my business out of graduate school, having read all of this academic research and kind of focusing on consulting during graduate school. I thought, I'm going to save the world from workplace bullies. So Civility Partners does a variety of things, or 4 things actually. We do workforce surveys. Then we work with the organization to figure out what to do with that data to make improvements. And we create and implement plans to address the survey results. We certainly do lots of training programs on topics like civility, microaggression, lots of manager trainings. And then lastly, we have a specialty niche in coaching leaders who bully.
I know we're going to get into a lot of these things, but I just want to say I'm really excited for this conversation because there's so many moments I've had a handful. I love that I've worked with companies that had a great culture, but I really do appreciate that I have worked in the workplace with Catherine, exactly what you're saying, that same type of bully that yelled, that was angry, that was just aggressive towards staff. I had a CEO that threw a chair across the room at one of my staff.
Nice.
And it's like, oh, that's what you thought was okay to do. And so in so many situations, we just want to eliminate that person, right? HR steps in, eliminate them, be gone. And what you're doing is going in and actually coaching and training that bully. Maybe they do get to the point of it's too extreme, right? Danielle, that's where she's going to help us kind of see where that line is, right?
You're cringing.
Right. But I love that part of the piece of what you do is coaching and coaching the bully. I think this is really fascinating.
Thank you. I'll just add, the reason I have to do that is because a lot of leaders out there don't want to get rid of this person because they're so valuable. So the only option in their mind is to keep them and try to save them. And, I sometimes joke, I shouldn't be doing that. That should not be a job, but it is.
Yeah, and it is. And if you can help and coach that person, then we all know the cost of having to let somebody go and then recruit and then rehire and all of that. So if they can bring in an expert like you to help support, train, and then maybe turn that person into a non-bully, then I'm sure it's going to help the company out a little bit more in that long run. So Danielle, I want to jump over to you because you are the other side of this, right? We've got Catherine kind of working to coach and build. And then there's this space of maybe they really have gone too far. So tell us about you. Tell us about what you do, how you got into this.
Thank you. Well, I went to law school like a lot of people kind of looking for a career. And frankly, I didn't really like a lot of the classes in law school. I mean, employment law was people, right? And it was interesting situations, and it really spoke to me. And that's what I decided to do when I got out of law school. So like a lot of young lawyers with some debt, we go to big firms and we work our 80 hours a week. We endure some bullying. We endure lots of different strange situations, right? Big law is kind of known sometimes for having different personalities, I guess I will say. People who bring in a lot of money to the firms and maybe aren't behaving the best. So I think we've all experienced, or I know I've experienced, some really interesting situations in my young career. But I got great training. I went on to figure out kind of what did I want to do with my life. When you start out, you do a lot of litigation defense work. And that's what I was doing, is defending companies once things got to a lawsuit, which is a great way to learn law. However, it's not really a way to make a difference, right? So as you start to get a little more training and experience, you can think about how do you advise clients, right? How do you get to that preventative side and teach them how to stay out of trouble, right? How to spot the bully, right? How to stop behavior earlier, how to coach employees, et cetera, how to help your managers manage. So I really got into a lot of that. And one thing that I really remember thinking early in my career is so many of these lawsuits probably could have been prevented with a better culture, right? If people would just sit down and have meaningful conversations earlier on And how could I, as an employment attorney, help them see that right earlier on? So I advised a lot of small and mid-sized businesses. And in California, as well as a lot of states, there is an obligation to do an investigation into a claim or a concern that employees raise. Certain types they trigger. And I really started doing a lot of workplace investigations. It was this neutral third-party work where I could come into companies and review a situation way before it got to a lawsuit, right? This is typically an employee who's engaged in the workforce, a current employee often, who has a concern and wants the company to look at it. And that's an opportunity, frankly, to save the employment relationship, right? To prevent a lot of the other things. And so companies do look at it as an opportunity. And I get to come in now, and this is what I do 100% of the time, fast forwarding 23 years from when I started practicing law. And now I get to come into companies and help them as a neutral third party and look at their situation and make some findings, factual based, so that they can decide what they need to do next. So I'll get into a lot more of that later, but that's what I get to do now all the time, and I love it. Yeah. And, I help companies meet their legal obligations and sometimes their cultural obligations to look at situations that are brought up and to figure out what to do next.
Yeah. So let's keep going with that. There's the culture obligations, there's the legal obligations. We have both of you that can go in and step in and help companies improve that toxic situation that's happening. So let's talk about culture from kind of this comparison of compliance versus perception, right? Culture versus legality. I don't necessarily have a formed question behind this. I just know that this is the direction we kind of want to start to go in. So talk to me about, and maybe Danielle, it starts with you, of, what's an example of, and Catherine, those situations that are kind of that in between both of you, where maybe it's more than toxic, but it's also not the totally legal extreme. You know what I mean? So let's go in this direction.
Catherine, do you want to start actually? Because I think sometimes when you get into a situation, you could find something for someone like me and someone like you, or, vice versa. I think there's so much overlap.
Yeah, for sure. I can start for sure. So there's a difference between an investigation like what Danielle is doing, which is, and Danielle, correct me if I'm wrong, focused essentially on whether or not a law was broken, right? That somebody engaged in sexual harassment, that's unlawful behavior. And so Danielle's job is to understand that, as well as the culture, because you're going to learn things. And again, I'll let you clarify for yourself. But what I'm looking at is perception. So when you do a workforce survey, we're asking people to rate the extent that they trust the leadership team, that they feel valued by their team, that they feel challenged, that they get enough feedback, that, and so we're asking, it's an opinion survey. And I'll also say we do a climate assessment, not an engagement survey. So a climate assessment's looking at many things: engagement, job satisfaction, inclusivity, leadership. Whereas a lot of organizations tend to kind of do that engagement survey. That's kind of the hot topic. And I would say that organizations probably need to be doing both. So in my opinion, and you said it earlier, Kendra, when you're talking about the person throwing the chair, and then you said, so you thought it was okay to do that? And that right there is the key. So if somebody complains about a hostile work environment and Danielle does an investigation, then it's like, what the organization has to look at itself and say, what's happening in the organization or not happening in the organization that somebody thought it was okay to throw a chair or do the millions of things that, the three of us have all come across in our work. And so I see that there's like this focus on the person and the thing that happened in that specific department or team. But what about the organization? And so we're able to look at perceptions. That's where I operate. And then we can say, okay, well, 20% of your workforce trusts leaders. That's a very low number. We've got to figure out how to address that. How do we create trust in the leadership team, as an example?
And Kendra, I'm usually mandated by law, right? So a company gets a complaint that either sounds like or maybe unlawful conduct, right? So this is the retaliation, the discrimination, the harassment. And, in most instances, the company has an obligation to look into that complaint in some way. It's not always bringing in an outside third party like me, but they have an obligation to review that, right? Now, out of that process, they may recognize that they have a larger issue and need somebody like Catherine. Maybe I'm done with my investigation and I give them the factual findings and they say to themselves, gosh, we really need to look at this department. We need to coach this leader, et cetera. So they could bring someone like Catherine in. Mm-hmm. Catherine could also be doing her assessments, right? And in one of the surveys, you could get a response that someone has a complaint of harassment or discrimination, and you're going to carve that off, right? And you're going to let the company and the client know, hey, somebody like, Danielle or whoever needs to be brought in and look at this. So there's definitely overlap. And I'm usually in more of the compliance, take care of this from a compliance perspective box.
Mm-hmm. And I see that it could go both ways, right? With whatever the situation is in that workplace, Danielle, they could reach out to you first, and then you see from your perspective of compliance and facts that it isn't something that maybe needs the legal side, but that they do need the support. And then you can kind of hand them to Catherine or somebody like Catherine, and vice versa, right? Yes. Catherine, a company could come to you and just think like, oh, we just need to do the climate assessment, see all the pieces. And then you can really see the pieces and then go, ooh, yep, you do need to go to Danielle and further. So I love that it could be from one of you to the other or vice versa. Do you see kind of a real specific space of where that divide is, or it really can go either way from when they're connecting with you?
I mean, I can speak to this, Catherine, and I think you probably agree. There's only certain things that have to be, quote, investigated, right? Mm-hmm. However, in our culture now, our broader culture, right, we use the words harassed, we use the words retaliated, right? I mean, I sometimes will get concerns where people will say, my boss won't stop harassing me for being late, right? And the company gets that as a complaint, right? And, they might think they need to bring in somebody like me, and they might, right? Or the employee might just be like, I'm annoyed because my boss keeps telling me I'm late, right? And that could be something that Catherine, so we don't always know, right? At least I don't always know when I'm brought in, whether a full-blown investigation needs to be done. And that's really the client's decision, the company's decision with their legal counsel to decide how far we go on my end. Mm-hmm. But I will say, I feel like whenever there's an investigation, there's a place afterwards for somebody like Catherine, because even if there's not a substantiated unlawful conduct that's occurring, there's stuff going on, right? And there's things that need to be looked at. So whether it's Catherine or a more general look at a department or whatever, there's always work to be done. And I love it that my clients typically do that work on the back end.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Yeah. That's, again, something's happening, even if it's unsubstantiated or it's just, I'm annoyed. Well, that's affecting performance. It's affecting team morale. It needs to be addressed from a different point of view, such as perceptions and kind of what we do.
Yeah. And so when companies are connecting with the both of you, my assumption in this, you can prove it otherwise, my assumption is that in most cases, they're coming to both of you in a very reactive moment, right? Here's the thing that's happening. They're in that stressed out, oh shit moment. We need help. And that's when they're bringing the both of you in. Talk to me about what that looks like when they're reactive to a situation versus do you have companies that come to you in more of a proactive approach and not wanting to see a situation get to that point, not wanting that boss to ever scream and yell or throw chairs?
Catherine, you're probably better positioned. I mean, I am definitely the reactive resource, right? But Catherine, I'm sure you can speak to the preventative.
Yeah, I mean, Danielle's not being called in for an investigation unless somebody actually, says it's a hostile work environment or something to that effect. Then, no one's doing an investigation. Just for shits and
fun.
giggles.
Just to write the check.
From my perspective, yes, it is reactive, but I've never thought about this until just right this moment. So thanks for my little epiphany I just had. My clients all come to me because they're being reactive, but what they're reacting to is on a huge spectrum. So sometimes, it's publicly claiming that I'm being harassed because I'm a woman, and it's out on blogs, and the company's forced into doing something because they need to be able to put out some press releases. And unfortunately, that's what drove them to do that. With the coaching, a lot of times the narrative is that HR has been trying to talk the CEO into putting some resources towards coaching or solving this problem. And the CEO has been saying, don't you dare touch them. They are a high producer. And then there's some sort of slap in the face. And that ranges. It could be the 7th investigation, finally the straw that broke the camel's back, or the first, or another important person quit and cited that other. So there's often is some sort of, I kind of say slap in the face of the CEO going, all right, I get it. We need to solve it. But on the other end, I have my really positive clients who come to me because they think the sky is falling because turnover's gone up just a little bit. And they're still reacting. But from my perspective, I'm like, thank you. You're good. We appreciate working with you versus. So yeah, I mean, they're, in my mind, it's like, oh, good, you're being proactive, but they're kind of, something horrible is happening and we got to fix it. And that means they have a great leadership, right? Because that means leadership's going, something is a little bit amiss and we better solve it.
Yeah. And that difference in perspective of the company, of the leadership, you want those leaders that think the sky is falling when there's a little bit of turnover versus these other ones that, you've got screaming and yelling and chairs flying and they're like, oh, well, maybe this isn't good, right?
Yeah.
So
maybe we should fix this. What should we do? Chairs are flying. What should we do?
Right. And it goes back to what we were saying, like what you will tolerate in a company. Some companies are a little more rugged and rough around the edges, and that's the culture. And some others are the ones where, the sky is falling when there's a little bit of turnover. And that's the beautiful thing that I love about culture and when you're finding somebody that's the right fit, because one person may be the perfect fit for one of those companies. And then this other company that's a little more rough around the edges, they maybe wouldn't be a great fit for. And that's the beautiful part of culture. Mm-hmm. And then the tricky part when it comes into conversations like this, right? Of what's acceptable, what's not, what's pushing the line. Right. Catherine, I want to jump back to something you said in the beginning. You mentioned that we are far behind as the U.S. when it comes to situations like this and the workplace and compliance and whatnot. Can both of you, either of you, can you elaborate on this a little bit? Like, tell us a little bit more about this difference with how things are going here versus other countries, because I've heard this before.
Yeah, I'll start off by saying, in my opinion, bullying and harassment are the same behaviors.
Okay.
The only difference is who you aim them at. So if we all work together and I only pick on, I'm only bullying and or harassing, a person of a certain race, that's harassment, right? They have a claim. Danielle comes in, does an investigation. Hey, it seems Catherine's only picking on the one person of color. That could be harassment. If I pick on everybody, that's the loophole, equal opportunity harassing. So if I'm picking on everybody and I'm just that's lawful. They're defined differently in the law, and that's to say harassment obviously has federal laws, and then lots of states have their own laws around it. California has workplace bullying, or what we call abusive conduct, but it's not unlawful. It only has to be discussed in our mandatory harassment prevention training, and it is defined very differently than bullying or than harassment. So when I started doing research in graduate school and reading all this academic research, countries like Sweden, Australia, Denmark, the Nordic countries, all four of them have very clear laws prohibiting workplace bullying. So there is no equal opportunity harassment, or it's not lawful to engage in that behavior in many countries. In the United States, for some reason, we're having a hard time understanding it's not just regulating people's moods. When I've watched, legislation has been introduced in several states over the years. And when I watch those committee hearings and things, often what they're saying is, well, we can't regulate people's moods. People are allowed to be uncivil. And it's like, no, that we're talking about abuse, essentially domestic violence at work. And so we're just having a hard time recognizing that here in the United States. I will give Puerto Rico a shout out, though. They are the one and only state/territory where workplace bullying is unlawful.
Wow.
So good for them.
Yeah, it's a start. If they can help influence. And how do we do that? Like how, because this isn't the first time that I've heard this when it comes to these conversations of culture. It comes up a lot in the conversation of DEI as well.
Mm-hmm.
The US, we just love our acronyms. So we're like, oh, we're good. We have a DEI initiative. And it's, this taggy thing that we had to put an acronym to so that we could put it in the forefront of people's minds so that they could pay attention to this in the workplace. Then you look at other countries and they're like, we just do it. There's no acronym needed. They just are very inclusive and they find ways to have a diverse population that works there. And so this isn't the first time I've heard, the difference with us versus other countries just kind of having it together in the culture space.
I have a couple comments. One is, we're a very individualistic society versus the Nordic countries, for example, where it's very collectivistic. So there is kind of just natural awareness of how everyone is feeling in other countries that are not individualistic. I do think over time, as we move in through the future, the three of us did not have bullying assemblies and stuff when we were in kindergarten, right? But now that's pretty normal. So the younger workforce, as it takes over, who has grown up being more aware of bullying and empathy. I mean, my kids are learning about emotional intelligence and the 7 habits, in elementary school. So I do think that we will get somewhere with this as the younger workforce, comes in. The older workforce, it's like work until you die, keep your head down, shut up and take it and just go with it, right? There's no crying in baseball, but we're moving away from that. So I don't know. I mean, honestly, and Danielle, I'm curious about your opinion. The definition of harassment, that it's essentially feels like it's part of being employed there, that you have to endure that if you're going to work there, or it's so severe or pervasive, a reasonable person considers it intimidating, hostile, or abusive. Yeah. Those two things describe workplace bullying. If you're being bullied, it feels like a condition of employment and it's intimidating, hostile, and abusive. So I don't know what the answer is, but yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to add, I think everything you said, Catherine, is correct about the US versus other countries, or some other countries, right? And kind of how our society grew up, right? This is just me talking, how we're individualistic and the capitalist and all of those things kind of combining, right? A more litigious society, right? And one thing that I do want to give a shout out to is, at least in California, we have a lot of protected statuses that a lot of other states don't have. So the discrimination and the harassment and the retaliation based on, a lot of different protected statuses that we don't have in other states. And so we're doing it in a weird way, right? Because we're carving out, right, all these things instead of just saying all of this behavior is terrible. But at least we have more in some states than others, right? And more things are protected. But I mean, I think you bring up a great point, Catherine. I think that it's hard to imagine listening to hearings to see those blockers of kind of like, well, we can't make people nice, right? We can't make them, civil. And it's like, why not, right? Like, why don't we want to legislate that, right? And I know it's challenging to regulate and to legislate, but a lot of the investigations I get brought in, not a lot, but a good portion of them, it's really bullying, right? Mm-hmm. It's really a lot of bullying conduct that maybe doesn't have that legal hook. So it's not substantiated because of someone's gender, but it's happening, right? And a lot of times in investigations, what we do is we sort of slice the evidence and the factual finding into, what was the conduct, right? And we make a finding about whether something occurred in the way that the person says it occurred. And then we make a separate finding about essentially motive, right? Like, did this happen because of this, right? Because of this protected status. And I would say a lot of times you're seeing, the chair did get thrown against the wall, but it wasn't because of this person's gender. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, so does that make it okay? That's not my decision to make. That's the company's decision to make under their own policies. And if they have a bullying policy and if they want that kind of culture. But a lot of times, the chair was thrown against the wall. Mm-hmm. It wasn't because, that person's Black, but the chair was thrown against the wall. Right. And this guy throws chairs against the wall for everybody. So again, what are you left with? Right. Like, that's okay.
Yeah.
Is it okay? I don't know. Right.
That's where the culture piece comes in, right? Yeah. You get to decide that's not okay, even though it's not unlawful. Just like being late. Being late's not unlawful, but people get terminated for that all around the world all the time. And it's weird. There's this weird thing in HR that I've come across of like, how do I solve bullying? It's not unlawful. I mean, I literally get that question from C's of HR people at a conference. And I'm like, well, do you fire people for yelling at a client? Do you fire people for, there's so many things that are not unlawful, but they're against productivity and they're disruptive or they're causing harm in some other way. And we discipline and terminate employment. I don't understand. It's like this weird, people's brain, the synapses stop firing when you start talking about bullying and harassment. I don't understand it, to be honest.
Yeah, because it is that weird in between, right? Of culture, compliance, what's okay. One of you just said it though, like, why can't we teach people to be kinder? And I love that that's something, Catherine, that your kids are learning, emotional intelligence. Mm-hmm. Both of you mentioned, these younger generations, and I think that they are going to start to flip the script a little bit because, Catherine, you said it, right? Some of the other generations, we just head down, go to work, you go in at this time, you're done at this time, you deal with whatever you're going to deal with, right? Oh, it's not against the law. Okay, let me do my job, get my paycheck, go on. And these younger generations are helping us to flip the script a little bit with what they're learning and what they're tolerating. I'd be curious to know from both of you if you see that in the clients that you're working with. Do you see the shift in, the generations that you're working with? Do you see the shift in who's kind of pushing the cards? Or Danielle, maybe the younger employment force is maybe bringing some of these issues to you more than they were in the past. I mean, both of you have been in your roles for a decent amount of time, so I'd be curious to know just kind of the shift that you're seeing with all the generations as well.
You first, Danielle. I'm curious about your answer.
I mean, anecdotally, I will say, somebody asked me the other day, why are all of the workplace investigators booked and busy? And why are there so many complaints, right? And, and for a workplace investigation, right, somebody calls us up, like they need us yesterday, right? Like they can't wait for 2 weeks till I'm free, right? And so I think there's always been a lot of complaints that maybe were not handled well by companies. I think the visibility brought on by different social justice movements, whether it's Me Too and Black Lives Matters and generational shifts and general awareness and expectations, like you said, of workers. I hate to say, oh, it's the younger generation, but, as generations go by, we do have more expectations of our work, right? Of our work lives. And, I think COVID actually, interestingly, had at least from my perspective, workplace investigations really ballooned during COVID. I thought they were just going to die off, right? Like nobody's in the break room anymore touching anybody or saying anything weird. So we're not going to have any workplace investigations. And that's not what happened. Because I think that as people kind of had time to reflect on their work life, right? And their work life was then brought into their house and everything was kind of mishmashed together, right? Personal and professional. People were unhappy, right? And people left the workforce and didn't come back. And so, I think culture can drive numbers as well, Catherine. And I think that as things move faster in the world and things are more competitive in companies, especially I think in the tech world or in California, specifically compared to some other parts of the country, things are moving so fast and we might not take the time to have the conversations with people that we need to be having. And that leads to people guessing what's going on, right? Why was I laid off? Why am I getting this performance improvement plan when nobody's ever told me that I wasn't doing a good job? And that in and of itself can prompt somebody to feel like, well, what's going on here? There's something strange. I need to fill in the gaps. And I'm not saying that people don't have valid concerns. I'm just saying that there's just more sort of unrest going on. So, yeah.
I want to add something too. I think technology plays a role too, right? Because before, 20 years ago, you had your job. And then if you didn't want to be there, you found another job in your local area. But now I can go online and get a job in another country if I want and work from my house. So it's easier to go, forget this. I don't want to be treated this way. I'm out of here. So there's that piece. And also I think, I know, for example, you can put a bot inside your Slack and it monitors tone and word choice. And so there's a lot of ways too, to really monitor culture now that we didn't have before. And the Slack bot can say, I'm noticing lots of talking about something in this department or among this team, something to pay attention to, so, and of course, things like Glassdoor, just posting on Facebook, I hate my job and I work here, don't ever work there, and so I think that obviously is just going to continue to put the pressure on employers to care about this, even if they don't want to.
What about the kind of the opposite of that? We have, like you said, the bot that can kind of keep an eye on things. But Danielle, you mentioned it, right? We can so quickly just be like, this is not for me, I'm out. And then not even doing, exit interviews. So maybe that information isn't even making it to leadership. They're just seeing, right? People are leaving. And nobody's even having a conversation around the issues that are happening. They're just, because like you said, Catherine, you can go get a job remote wherever. And so instead of even bringing it to leadership, having a workplace where you can be open about conversations, you just leave, right? And I did this. So I asked this question because I've been in this position where I had a leader who was a bully in the workplace and screamed and yelled at teams. And I brought it up a couple times and it didn't really go anywhere. And so I did exactly that. I went, I don't need to do this anymore. And I quit. I had no job lined up. I just knew that that's what I had to do. And so I'm curious to know from both of your perspectives, how does this start to affect the companies when you have these leaders that maybe don't even really know who's the bully and what's going on? They just see people bounce and leave. And to the point of, you were talking about Glassdoor, like maybe they're just so fed up, they're not even writing anything. So when other people go to Glassdoor, they're like, oh, well, 4 years ago, this company, look at all these great reviews. But really everybody now is just bouncing so fast. Like, I'd be curious to know your perspectives on this when it is shifting and turning over so quickly.
Well, then we're back to the survey, right? That's the way that leaders are going to know. I know a lot of times in exit interviews, that's sometimes some of the data we're looking at. And if HR doesn't have the CEO's ear, then it doesn't really matter what HR uncovers. And so I think there's a couple things. One is the CEO has to see HR as a valuable addition to the team, not a cost center. Yep. So that when HR says, I'm hearing of these problems and here's what we should do about it, the leader's taking that in. Just like if the CTO said, we're having a, risk of somebody tapping into our database, here's what we should do about it. The CEO is going to go, oh yeah, we need to fix that. So CEOs need to see HR as a partner. And I would say anybody looking for a job, that's a great question to ask in your interview. What's, assuming you're talking to HR, what's your relationship like with the leader? Because that'll tell you. And then doing the surveys, it gives people the ability to be super confidential and say whatever it is they need to say, and then you can solve it. So I don't know why leaders would not be open to doing surveys, but of course we come across them all the time. I'm still I understand people who bully very well. I definitely have a long way to go to understand why leaders do or don't do certain things.
Yeah. It's Catherine, it's so interesting because I've had a couple of investigations come out of surveys, right? And they're anonymous and, people are starting to raise things that are sort of rising to the level of potential unlawful conduct. And I also see investigations that arise from anonymous complaints. And so this is kind of the other version, Kendra, of people leave, right? Or they're still there, but oftentimes they've left and they submit an anonymous complaint to an organization and just kind of like list out all the things, right, that have been happening, right? And sometimes there's multiple anonymous complaints that converge on a department, right? And that's something that leadership looks at and wants to understand. Sometimes we'll see it in an exit interview, and that's when somebody like me will get brought in, but hopefully somebody like Catherine as well or before. And then the other piece is. There's sometimes people just leave and then they go find a lawyer and they send a letter and say, all of this was going on and nobody was paying attention. And I tried to raise it, maybe Kendra, and nobody really listened. And now we've got a full-blown lawsuit, right, on our hands as a company. So there's just so many different points of entry, I would say, where you can, or a company can sort of decide to pay attention. If they have the time, the inclination, the resources, and the support, right? The support of the organization. So it really has to come.
I love the way you said that. I love that, Danielle. Yeah, there's so many opportunities if you just listen and are willing to do so.
Yeah.
It's interesting. The podcast that we recorded a couple of weeks ago was all based around this conversation of psychological safety and feeling like you could talk and you can say something. And it's interesting how it intertwines into this, right? Do you say something while you're there? Do you say something when Catherine's doing these climate assessments? Or do you just leave? And then Danielle, like you said, then you take action afterwards when you're not even there and not even part of the situation anymore. I think it's interesting how all of these conversations connect and interact.
Diverge, yeah. And Kendra, that's another interesting point is that I'll get a lot of employees, if there's a current complaint, and, I go talk to a lot of different employees and I call them witnesses, right? And I talk to them and some of them are scared because even though it wasn't their complaint, they don't even want to be involved, right? And they're starting to express what the culture is like for them, right? And sometimes I'll get people say, I'm afraid of retaliation, or I don't want to meet at the office because I don't want anybody to know that I'm talking to you. And it's not even their complaint. So the fact that they are expressing this fear, right, and this concern about even being tangentially involved, right, giving information about someone else's complaint shows you a lot about the culture. And I typically always, of course, let my clients know, hey, this is what this person feels, or not necessarily this person, but this is what I'm hearing from some of these employees. And I'm happy to say I feel like a lot of my clients do take that information and do something positive with it. They want to hear about that. So I don't know, Catherine, I'm also interested to hear, as resources, how much do resources factor into a company's decision to kind of pay attention more or invest or get in at those earlier entries of opportunity? Because that's always something in the back of my head.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we unfortunately do, get where we've kind of gone through a sales process to talk about things they need. And they're telling us about some horrible thing happening. And we're saying, here's what we would do, and here's what it would cost. And then we can't afford that. Sorry. And that's unfortunate, because what they're missing, and of course, we're always trying to highlight that for them, is that it's costing you a lot more, this whole thing, and has already cost you a lot more, depending on how long it's been going on. And unfortunately, we can't always get through to them. So, it's an investment, but it's a good investment, and there's a return on it on the other side. It's hard to quantify, though, because it's not a new software program where this is going to improve productivity by 20%. It's, here's all this research that says this will improve productivity and customer loyalty and blah, blah, blah. But can we pinpoint that to you specifically? Not necessarily. But we try to do that as we're consulting, of like, what are some outcomes that would help us look back and say things are different now.
Yeah.
And better, and there was some return.
Yeah, it's not as cut and dry as, hey, we're going to implement this, and the increase in revenue is going to be X amount of dollars.
Right.
I do feel like there's more metrics behind it today than when both of you started in this space. I even think about that from the perspective of my company, right? So Culture Crush is a podcast, but it's a company. It's a hub of resources for improving company culture. We bring together all of these resource partners. They're in one hub. They're in one location. So when companies are in these moments of, how do we do this? How do we grow? What's the resource? They're looking for the Catherine and the Danielles, right? They don't know how to find you. They come to us. We make those connections and make those partners so that they can find you. I think about even that. If I was trying to do this 5 years ago, this wouldn't be a business. Right. And so the resources are there. I feel like more of the data and the metrics are there.
Yeah.
And Catherine, to your point, it's still not as cut and dry for some leaders. They want there to be this. It's one of those math equations when we were a kid. This plus this equals this.
I will say it is possible. So I'll throw out a resource on my homepage, Civility Partners. We have a culture calculator. All we've done is taken research from MIT. I think HBR is one, and you enter in, I think, 4 numbers. Okay. And we've taken that research that says disengaged employees cost you X percent. And so we've created, we think, a fairly valid, calculator to say this is what it's costing you to have disengaged employees. And then another thing is just like open up an Excel sheet and think it through. Let's see. I personally, as HR, have spent 100 hours on this over the last 2 years. I'm worth X dollars an hour. That's the cost. And then I could have been doing something else. Mm-hmm. And just the actual cost of turn, all that. So it can be done. It will still feel a little theoretical to a CEO who's super data driven, but you can get there.
Mm-hmm. And do you see, because both of you mentioned there's this close connection with HR, right? Mm-hmm. Danielle, when you're going in, and Catherine, when you're working with them, what's that relationship between HR and the CEO? With the companies that you're working with, do you see larger companies, mid-sized companies usually working with you as opposed to small businesses? Because I'm even thinking of some small businesses that maybe have a decent amount of staff, but don't even actually have their own HR person. They maybe have a small company that does some of the HR work, but they don't really have an HR person, right? Do you see a difference in the size of companies that are reaching out?
Yeah, I mean, our clients range from fairly small, like 25 to 50 all the way up to global, organizations. And, I'll never claim that we're able to change culture in, the Chevrons of the world, for example. But when we're working with those large agencies, we are at least getting to affect change in some corner of that giant company. And so, it really does vary. I do see that, for example, we have a client right now, sorry to throw ADP under the bus, but they used ADP to do an investigation. That person failed to interview the person being complained about. So not good. So now their employment law attorney is saying, well, you can't fire him because you didn't ask him or talk to him. And this is a great little learning lesson too for leaders. Talking to that CEO who has been there for 25 years and he's on his way out in the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah.
When I had a conversation with him, because he had been getting these little complaints, people called him creepy, not the CEO, but people called this individual creepy. And they were telling the CEO he's kind of creepy. And it's exactly what we're talking about. Well, that's not unlawful. I don't even know what that really means. It's not against our policy. The guy was a high producer. So the CEO just continued to kind of let it go. And here we are. And the whole, I almost said a bad word, the whole thing blew up in their faces. And he is going to retire at whatever point, always feeling like he failed miserably. None of that stuff that he's done over the last 25 years is going to matter. And you could just feel how devastated he is that this is going to be his legacy and that he allowed this to happen, that he wasn't paying attention when people said this person is creepy. And so, that's another way while we're talking about return on investment, I guess, or convincing leaders that leaders need to ask themselves what kind of legacy they want to leave behind. And this poor CEO is going to, he's gonna, I feel for him. I understand he didn't do the right thing all along, but I'm just like, oof, that's a horrible position.
That's a rough way to end things. Yeah. I mean, I go into all different types of companies, Fortune 500 companies, public companies, small companies, to do workplace investigations. And I think the main thing that I see is, I mean, at the big companies, Kendra, there's potentially a whole in-house investigations team, right? Who runs investigations for the whole company. And they might still bring in an outsider for certain types of investigations. And I do a decent amount of those, but I would say that the top-down sort of approach to the compliance piece, the investigation, the fact that it's having to happen, what it means to the organization, how seriously they take it, that is felt throughout different layers of the organization. And that makes my job easier, right? When the company's like, hey, we take this seriously, and we're going to have some confidentiality provisions, and we're going to remind everybody that they're not going to be retaliated against for speaking, and they jump in if there's something happening in the investigation that needs their attention, right? And the leadership is supporting HR's efforts to make sure that this process runs as a neutral, impartial, good investigation to get to the bottom of things, right? And so you feel that connection, right, when it's there, and you feel it when it's not there, at least from my perspective. So I'm sure the employees feel it as well. So.
And this is such an important conversation as we continue to grow in the workforce and become better, and letting leaders know that these resources are out there, right? Like, Catherine, when you and I first met and you were saying that your job is essentially coaching the bully in the workplace, I was mind blown. I was like, this is fascinating.
We actually met on a podcast.
We were on a cool job.
Right? We were both guests on another podcast. And then afterwards, I'm like, Catherine, we need to talk. This is fascinating. So I am thrilled that we got to have the opportunity to start this conversation. I also feel like this is one of those conversations that we need like a part 2 and a part 3, because there's so many ways that you can break this up. I mean, even right now, I was like, what are some of the red flags that people could see? Like, that could be a whole other episode. So without making it a whole other hour long, as we start to wrap up, I have one last question, and then I'll give both of you kind of the chance to give your final thoughts. But I want to make sure if there's any other little bits and pieces that you're like, oh, I really wanted Kendra to talk about this or whatnot, I want you to have that chance now, which I think will tie into this last question. So my last question for you both is, what is one thing you wish people would ask you about the work that you're doing, but they don't? So that is kind of my last question to both of you. So what do you wish, what's the one thing that you really wish people would ask about you and the work that you do? And then any final thoughts before we start to wrap up? So either one of you can take this.
Well, I have one. People never ask me, like, why do you like doing workplace investigations? They seem so messy. And people just don't really ask me that, right? I've been an employment lawyer for 2 decades. And why are you focusing on this work now, right? What do you like about it? And what I like about it is I am trying to understand what may have happened and how it impacted people. And that just seems really important to start moving the needle, right? Again, I don't get involved in making a recommendation at the end. I don't even ever necessarily know what happens at various organizations when I finish an investigation. And that's hard, right? However, most of my clients I know want to know what happened. They want to know what's going on. And I feel like that's the first step for them, hopefully then taking that information and, quote, doing the right thing, whatever that may be. So that's what I like. I like being a little slice of that, right? And a little, I like sitting with people and really getting their stories. So, yeah.
Ooh, I love that. That's a good answer.
Yeah.
I don't have one. I was racking my brain. I think part of it is because I will tell you everything I have to say with whether you ask me or not, which actually ties it back into our conversation earlier about the paradigm slowly shifting where we are caring more about people. I mean, when I started 15 years ago, be at networking events. What do you do, Catherine? Oh, I have a company focused on solving workplace bullying. And people would joke, oh, do you take them outside and beat them up? Or they'd say, what is that? So I started this before we were talking about it. And so maybe I've recognized that a big part of my very disruptive brand is just like, well, let me tell you about it because you clearly don't understand. So I guess I don't have an answer.
That's okay. That's an answer in itself. I mean, especially with what you're doing and what you've been doing for so long, you were a forward thinker. You weren't disrupting this space where, as I feel like a lot of people, it came to the front of conversations through COVID, right? They're like, oh, well, now I can work remote or now I can't, it shifted things a little bit. And now we can have those conversations and people understand a little more where you're coming from. But when you started, you were disrupting this space. You were doing something new and different that people probably don't even know the questions to ask. So you just get to share and tell them. Yeah. Beautiful. And so do either one of you have, what are your last final, your little nugget, your little takeaway, whatever it is? Danielle, we'll start with you. What other last final little note do you want to share?
I mean, nothing major. We're workplace investigators. So if you have a workplace investigation and you need us, we're in California and we've got 3 investigators and, we would love to talk with you and send you in the right direction. So, yeah.
Beautiful. And if folks are looking, they're listening and they're like, oh, we do need her. And they're looking for you and looking how to reach you. How can they find you?
We're altaemploymentlaw.com. So, yeah. And we're actually looking to hire too. So if there's any people listening out there that want to do workplace investigations, you can come work with us.
Oh, beautiful. Catherine, what about you? What are your final nuggets for today?
I have 2 final nuggets. One is having been through what I went through personally, and Danielle can speak to this too, the horrible things that we've seen and the horrible impact it can have on people. I really believe that it's an employer's moral and ethical responsibility to create an environment where people thrive. You have to. What we do for work is such a huge part of our identity and self-esteem, and we just should not tolerate employers who don't care about that. And the other thing I'll say is we got to stop putting things in boxes of compliance. Is this lawful or unlawful? This is our DEI program. This is our employee engagement program. And certainly you have to do some of that to function. And obviously compliance is different, and you do have to, because the law says, but let's stop getting so focused on the different things. They all intertwine. Psychological safety is psychological safety. You can't have engaged employees unless they can be their whole selves at work, which is the DEI component. You're going to have, people are less likely to break the rules if they're happy. They're not going to be engaged in harassment if the culture doesn't permit it at the organization. So this stuff is all intertwined, and we need to approach it from a more holistic place. And so I would encourage all employers out there to do that.
I could not have said that more beautifully. It is very much, I agree, a moral and ethical responsibility of employers nowadays. And it should have been like this all along, but at least we're having the conversations and we're making it happen now. So beautiful. Before I wrap up and send us out of here, I do want to play a little commercial for our sponsor again, Gateway Bank. They have been phenomenal. So we're going to play that first.
Remember when your banker knew you and cared about you? This experience still exists at Gateway Bank, the only community bank in Mesa, Arizona, serving customers Valley and nationwide. With Gateway, you get the fast personal service of a small bank with the convenience, security, and stability of a large one. Whether you need a loan or banking services for your business, they're here for you. Visit gcbaz.com/Culture Crush for details and a free consultation with Gateway President James Christensen.
As we wrap up, ladies, thank you again. This was absolutely phenomenal, and I'm really excited to stay in touch with both of you and connect you with some of our listeners and some of our community that are looking for this support, because it's absolutely needed. So thank you again to both of you.
Thank you.
And thank you to our listeners and everybody else for listening to another episode of the Culture Crush Business Podcast. Yes, we are a podcast. We started as a podcast. We're now really we're a big kid company. It's crazy. We are your hub of company culture resources. We have about 250 partners on our platform from across the country and Canada that are there to support you in various ways. So if it's something like the conversation we had today that you need support, all the way to mental health support, leadership, professional development, we have 8 different areas that we focus on for making the right match for companies to find what they need for company culture. So you don't have to just Google this stuff online anymore. You can come to us. We can help make that match happen so you're finding what you really need. So thank you again for everybody for joining in on another episode of the Culture Crush Business Podcast.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Culture Crush Business Podcast. Culture Crush is your hub for company culture resources. If you think your company has a strong culture that should be highlighted, we want to hear from you. If you are a company that supports growing great cultures, then we want to hear from you too. Connect with us at info@culturecrushbusiness.com.